At 78, ABBA's Benny Andersson finally confirmed what fans have speculated for decades, but few truly understood. The story of ABBA isn't just about the glittering costumes, catchy pop hooks, or sold-out arenas. Behind the dazzling lights was a man who kept his emotions behind piano keys, who created the soundtrack to millions of lives while quietly struggling with the chaos of his own. And now, after years of silence, Benny has opened up, not just about the music, but about her. And no, this isn't the story you think it is. Benny Andersson, one of the musical geniuses behind ABBA's iconic sound, long stood in the spotlight professionally, while carefully shielding his personal story in shadow. His melodies were uplifting, his harmonies unforgettable, but his silences over the years spoke volumes, especially when it came to relationships, loss, and one particular woman who had shaped more of his identity than he ever admitted publicly. To start his journey, you have to wind the clock back, not to glittering arenas or Eurovision glory, but to a small district in Stockholm called Vällingby, where a young Benny first fell in love with music. His father and grandfather, both accordion players, unknowingly passed down a legacy of melody and movement. The accordion was Benny's first instrument, a gift that sparked a love for rhythm that would one day span continents. But even then, it wasn't just about chords and keys. Music, for Benny, was emotional language. A way to feel without speaking, a secret code for expressing everything that real life made too messy. By 10, he had his first piano, and by 15, he had his first heartbreak, the type of pain that leaves an invisible fingerprint on a soul. He left school, chasing music in smoky clubs and teenage bands, slowly learning that success wasn't just talent, it was resistance, it was heartbreak, it was surviving rejection and still showing up the next day with a song. And it was during these formative gritty years that Benny first met Christina Grunwald, his teenage girlfriend and the mother of his first 2 children. Christina, long forgotten by the glittered-up narrative of ABBA, was more than just a footnote in Benny's early years. She was a grounding presence, someone who stayed behind the curtain while he stepped further into the footlights. Their relationship was passionate, creative and flawed, like many early romances are. Although they would split before ABBA was born, her influence remained, woven quietly into Benny's early lyrics and the emotional undercurrents of his compositions. While the spotlight would eventually turn to another woman, Anni-Frid Lyngstad, his future ABBA bandmate and wife, it was Christina who first experienced the raw, unshaped version of the man the world would come to know. But ABBA changed everything. When Benny met Björn Ulvaeus, musical partnership caught fire. There was undeniable chemistry, lyric met melody, logic met passion. Together, they didn't just form a group, they sculpted a phenomenon. And soon 2 women joined that equation, Björn's then wife, Agnetha Ältskog, with a crystalline voice and a haunted vulnerability, and Anni-Frid, Frida, independent, bold and magnetic. The world came to see them as a unit, Agnetha and Björn, Benny and Frida, 2 picture-perfect couples, 4 photogenic pop stars. But inside, and particularly for Benny, things were far more complicated. Even in their early years, Benny and Frida's relationship had a tension that pulsed beneath the harmonies. They were deeply in love, yes, but also deeply different. Frida, raised in the shadow of wartime trauma, sought freedom and expression. Benny, contemplative and introverted, learned to speak through composition but struggled with real-time connection. Their music brought them together, but the pressures of fame, endless travel, and creative perfectionism began pulling them apart. Still, they tried. They got married in 1978, at the peak of ABBA's fame, as if solidifying the relationship would protect it from the storm. It didn't. Just 2 years later, they separated. The world didn't see the tears, the silence, the hurtful words whispered behind tour buses and television appearances. Benny barely ever spoke about it. Until now. Recently, in a rare and moving interview, Benny finally revealed more than he ever had before, not just about the end of their marriage, but about the complexity of their connection. With soft eyes and a voice tinged with reflection, he spoke 4 words that stunned fans worldwide. I never stopped caring. And then quietly, he spoke about her. Not just Frida the singer, not Frida the prince's widow, or the woman at his side during the most explosive era in pop music history, but Frida the person, as she truly was, as only he could have ever known her. There was a long pause after Benny's words. Not because he didn't have more to say, but because, like the perfect pause in a song, it meant more than any melody. I never stopped caring. It broke the curtain that had stood between his genius and his grief, between the audience and the artist. For decades, fans speculated about the end of ABBA, blaming fame, fatigue, or simply the passage of time. But now, Benny hinted at a deeper reason, an emotional undercurrent that had haunted both the band and himself. Frida was never just another singer in the lineup. She was, in his words, the electricity under the harmony. While Agnetha's voice floated like crystal, Frida's grounded the music, earthy, bold, full of unspoken pain. And Benny, perhaps more than anyone, understood the source of that pain. Frida, born at the end of World War II, to a young Norwegian mother and a German soldier, carried a legacy of rejection. Her mother died when she was only 2. She was raised by her grandmother, despised by her community, and taught never to draw attention to herself unless she could sing her way out of it. To Benny, Frida's trauma wasn't just a story, it echoed in her phrasing, her posture, even in the way she laughed carefully during interviews. He saw it in the studio, how she closed her eyes when she hit difficult notes, how she kept emotions just behind her eyes, threatening to spill. And sometimes, when the studio doors were closed, and only silence remained, those emotions did spill. Benny saw Frida cry more times than anyone else in the group. Not for fame, not for performance, but for something harder to name. So when they fell in love, it felt big, cinematic, like the kind of story that could write itself into every verse they ever composed. But as Benny now admits, they were in love with each other's potential, not necessarily each other's truth. We were expanding, he said in his candid interview, rapidly, as people, as artists, as egos, but we didn't grow together. The honesty in that statement floored those who had clung to the idea that the band's breakup was simply a career choice. In reality, it had been emotional attrition, not just the end of 2 relationships, but the collapse of an ecosystem, where music and emotion had lived too closely intertwined. Fans always assumed it was Agnetha and Björn's divorce that shook ABBA to the core, and in some visible ways, it did. The Winner Takes It All wasn't just a hit, it was a public post-mortem. But Benny and Frida's split cut even deeper. Where Agnetha and Björn often argued, sometimes publicly, Benny and Frida remained polite, professional, and as Benny puts it, quietly devastated. They continued working together after their separation. There were no outbursts, no accusations, just a slow, almost silent unraveling. Even now, Benny admits, that was worse. The silence. By the early 80s, everything about ABBA had changed. The sparkle started to dim. Recording sessions felt heavier. Creativity turned to obligation. Benny buried himself in the work, producing, mixing, composing, as if sound could drown sorrow. Frida began distancing herself emotionally, even geographically, moving away from the band's Stockholm base whenever she could. Despite all of it, they never let the public feel the fracture. On stage, their harmonies still soared. In interviews, their smiles still convinced, but privately, something essential had ruptured. Not hatred, not betrayal, something more complex, something harder to assign blame for weariness. In retrospect, Benny now recognizes the emotional toll this took, not just on him, but on Frida. We thought continuing to sing together would make it easier, he confessed, but sometimes, singing with someone you love, used to love, is more painful than walking away. When ABBA quietly disbanded in 1982, no farewell tour was planned, no final press conference, no big goodbye. They drifted away, like a song that fades rather than ends, still echoing in the hearts of millions. And for Benny, the music didn't stop, but the feeling did. Years passed, they both moved on. Benny married Mona Narklet in 1981. Frida, years later, married into German nobility, becoming Princess Anni-Frid of Reuss. Their lives carried on, outwardly successful, but emotionally complex. And through all those years, Benny spoke very little about Frida, not out of shame or avoidance, but because, he says, I never found the right words, until now. In the last part of the interview, what truly stunned people wasn't just Benny's admission that he still cared. It was what he said about regret. Asked if he would have done anything differently, he answered quietly, almost in a whisper, I would have asked her what she needed. Back then I didn't know how. It wasn't about the marriage. It wasn't even about ABBA. It was about emotional maturity, the distance between the man who wrote Dancing Queen and the one who now sits at a piano in his late 70s, playing to an empty room, whispering apologies through melody. In every generation, there's a band that defines more than just an era. It defines memories, moods, summers, and heartbreaks. For Benny Andersson, ABBA wasn't just music, it was identity, creation, catharsis, and ironically, it became the very thing that made him lose pieces of himself. When the final notes of ABBA faded into the early 80s, many assumed Benny, ever the composer, ever the craftsman, simply moved on. Chess became his next big project, a musical co-written with Björn that took a darker, more theatrical tone. Gone were the romantic ballads and disco beats. In came Cold War metaphors, emotional impasses, lonely kings and pawns, longing for connection. Critics called it brilliant. Fans called it a reinvention. But Benny has since admitted it wasn't just artistic growth, it was therapy. Everything that didn't get said in ABBA, I put into chess, he once noted. The tension, the unfinished conversations, the things he had buried under a decade of fame, began to surface in those new melodies. But what wasn't visible to the public was how much Frida still lived in everything he wrote, her voice, her energy, her legacy echoing between the lines of every chord progression, and yet, they didn't speak much. Years rolled forward with the quiet drifting of people who had once known each other too intimately. Benny stayed low-key, working behind the scenes in studios, on film scores, collaborating rarely and carefully. Frida, meanwhile, dove into a quieter life. After marrying Prince Heinrich Rousseau-Royce and moving to Switzerland, she had practically vanished from the entertainment world. The glamour gave way to mountain silence, and for a time, it seemed Frida had closed the door for good. But something about their story remained open-ended, and when the Mamma Mia musical phenomenon burst into the mainstream in the late 1990s, reimagining ABBA's songs in a new context of love, loss, and laughter, the idea of a reunion seemed inevitable. Still, Benny hesitated. He wasn't ready, not just musically, but emotionally. Reunions are easy when the past is simple, he once said. Ours wasn't. Offers came, some worth hundreds of millions. A billion-dollar tour proposal was reportedly brought to the group in the early 2000s. They declined, not because they didn't love the music, but because the scars behind it hadn't healed. Then came the losses. Frida's daughter, Lise Lotter, lost in a tragic car accident. Her prince, gone not long after to cancer. Grief surrounded her like fog, and Benny, though distant, felt it. People close to them say he tried to reach out, quietly, respecting her privacy. It was a pattern, emotional restraint, where once there had been music overflowing. The idea for ABBA Voyage started as an experiment, 2 new songs, maybe a studio session, just to see if the magic was still there. But what they found wasn't just harmony, it was healing. After being silent for so long, Benny said candidly, playing together again felt like forgiveness. It was in those moments, the quiet in between takes, the respectful nods, the gentle laughing at old in-jokes, that Benny began seeing Frida not as the partner he'd once lost, but as someone who remained, inexplicably and unmovably, part of his life. In May of 2025, they made a joint appearance at the 3rd anniversary of ABBA Voyage in London. No grand announcement, no rehearsed speech, just Benny in a patterned blazer, Frida in cream elegance, stepping onto the balcony like time hadn't stood still but had somehow circled back. The audience response was thunderous, cheers that lasted minutes. But more moving were the small things, the glance Benny gave Frida before speaking, the smile she returned, the subtle way their shoulders leaned together across 5 decades. Benny opened with humor, you'd expect nothing less, a cheeky joke. 2 men walk into a bar, that made Frida laugh harder than anyone in the room, and in that laughter lived something fragile, a shared history too complex to label, too painful to forget, and too beautiful to erase. Later that evening, Backstage and away from cameras, someone who attended the event shared that Benny and Frida sat alone for a few minutes in quiet conversation, just them. No band members, no assistants. At one point, Frida reportedly laid a hand gently on his, and Benny nodded, not talking, not performing, simply there, present. No statement was made about what was said. None was needed. In an era where celebrity stories are often commodified and syndicated, theirs remains elusive, authentic, and defiantly real. They were never perfect. They never claimed to be. But maybe that's what made their story resonate more today than ever before. Because who among us hasn't looked back at a great love and thought, what did I get wrong? What did I hold on to? What did I hold on to? What did I let go of too soon? For Benny, those questions used to live in silence. Now they live in music once again. For those who grew up with ABBA, their songs weren't just tunes, they were companions. Dancing Queen playing at teenage discotheques, Fernando drifting through midnight car rides, Chiquitita echoing through heartbreaks and hope alike. But for Benny Andersson, each of those songs carried double meanings. They were both soundtrack and diary, melodies that stitched together public success with private sorrow. And if ABBA's songs represented the world's joy, they also embodied Benny's emotional vocabulary, especially in the moments he couldn't, or wouldn't, speak. He often said, "I don't write lyrics, I write the emotions that lyrics live in." So when the group's lyrics began to change, with more sadness, more maturity, deeper longing, it said something even if Benny himself didn't. Take the Day Before You Came, released towards the end of ABBA's lifespan, sparse, haunting, and almost unnerving, a song that feels like a confession uttered into an empty room. Some critics saw it as a breakup tale, but Benny, decades later, he's confessed it might have been the most personal song he ever co-wrote, precisely because its meaning wasn't clear even to him at the time. "Oh, that song bothered me for years," he said in a quieter moment. "Only later did I realize it was about something I hadn't faced yet. Not a woman, exactly, not a moment, but a sense of losing someone, before you even realized how much she meant." Everyone assumed she was Agnetha, but Benny recently admitted the emotional silhouette in the song, the shadow of someone who changed everything before vanishing, might have been Frida all along. Art was never far from life, and the irony, he and Frida never had the fiery verbal wars the tabloids so often craved. Their breakup wasn't scandalous, it was subdued, dignified even. But that's what made it hurt more. It's easier to process a dramatic ending. It's harder when love leaves quietly, like steam rising from a teacup, slowly disappearing until only the cup remains. After ABBA's dissolution, Frida took a decade-long pause before releasing her deeply personal solo album Djupa Endeteg, which translates to Deep Breaths. The title alone reflected everything she hadn't said during her years with the band. Benny respected it but kept his distance. By that stage he had settled into a domestic and musical rhythm with his wife Mona, and yet something unspoken persisted. It wasn't love in the romantic sense, not desire, but a kind of reverence, a deep gratitude for what once was. As Benny describes it, it's like finding a handwritten letter decades later, and still knowing exactly why you wrote it. That stays. Even when both had moved on, in geography, relationships and careers, the bond defied closure. It found new expression in their recent collaborative silences, the kind of silence between two people who've seen each other cry, fail, falter, and still smile across a dimly lit studio, decades later. This transformation, from lovers to exes, to friends, to artistic kindred souls once again, feels rare in any story. But in Benny and Frida's case, it's particularly astonishing. Because everything about their past demanded distance, and instead, they chose music. ABBA Voyage wasn't just a technical marvel, for Benny it was spiritual surgery. Watching digital avatars of their younger selves prance across stage screens in front of thousands of ecstatic fans didn't provoke vanity, it provoked remembrance. They were us, Benny said, but they weren't. Those younger versions had pain they hadn't spoken, dreams they hadn't chased, regrets they hadn't gathered yet. Standing beside Frida in 2025, watching those past selves perform Knowing Me, Knowing You, Benny admitted, he forgot for a second they weren't real. It was like seeing a movie you forgot you acted in, he said.
and realizing how much of it was true. The holograms weren't there to replace Benny or Frida or any of the group. They were there to preserve a moment in time, one solidified not by perfection, but by passion. And watching them, Benny finally understood what millions of fans seemed to realize long before he did. ABBA wasn't just music, it was memory. Vulnerability behind glitter, real human messiness, polished into gold records. And perhaps the most stunning part of this revelation came not from a new hit or an old memory, but from Frida herself. In a rare public comment, she said during the anniversary ceremony, "We spent years apart pretending we'd finished our story, but maybe we were still writing it. Pages don't close just because we stop looking." In that moment, with Benny standing beside her, the fans weren't watching nostalgia. They were watching healing. What makes a story unforgettable? Is it the high notes, the triumphs, the glimmer, the millions of voices singing along? Or is it the quiet, off-stage moments, the truths whispered in rehearsal rooms, the looks across hotel lobbies, the unplayed songs left in notebooks? For Benny Andersson, the answer has become clearer with age. The applause was never the most important part, it was the connection. And the most profound connection, the most enduring, remains the one with the very person he once hurt the most, and who, in some quiet, unfathomable way, still chose to stand beside him all these years later. Frida has long been framed as the fiery one, the free spirit. The press painted her bold and untamable back in the 70s, glamorous, defiant, different. But Benny always saw something gentler underneath, not fragility, but compassion. A softness that never needed attention, and often went unseen. That's what made losing her so complicated, not explosive, just quietly consuming. In recent interviews, Benny acknowledged that creating ABBA often came at the expense of emotional honesty. The pressure of perfection, the need to write hit after hit, to tour non-stop, to satisfy a music industry constantly wanting more, left little room for vulnerability. "We were learning how to become global stars," he said, "but we weren't learning how to be better for each other. And in that harsh spotlight, even love can dehydrate. The warmth fades, the understanding thins. The music, ironically, stays strong, but the bond behind it begins to hollow." But now, decades later, both Benny and Frida can freely admit what went unsaid, that they were too young to know themselves, too overwhelmed to understand each other, and too committed to keeping the music alive to notice that something inside them was fading. And yet even now, they're drawn back into each other's orbit, not out of regret, but out of recognition. That recognition was never clearer than one quiet moment during ABBA Voyage's anniversary. It was an inside joke from 1977. "You wouldn't get it, but I did." And that's the thing, he did. Even after 40 years, with separate lives and broken chapters, the meaning between them hadn't vanished. It had just gone dormant, asleep under all the noise of fame and history, and in that one laugh, it woke up again. There's something quietly revolutionary about two people with a shared past choosing to return, not to rewrite the ending, but to honor what it was. And in doing so, they breathed deeper meaning into what ABBA really stood for. It wasn't just music that lived on vinyl and on stage, it was human resilience. It was the grace of circling back, the beauty of rediscovery. And it seems that Benny, always the silent one, understood this now more than ever. As he navigates his late 70s, Benny remains as creatively energized as projects continue, melodies still find their way to his piano keys. But now, instead of writing from pressure or deadlines, he writes from clarity. He has said that songs today are less about hits, and more about legacy, less about telling stories to the world, and more about writing letters to his past. To sit beside someone you once shared everything with, he shared, and realize that even though time has taken the romance, it left the respect. He trailed off, eyes misty. Well, that's a different kind of love. What Frida and Benny share now may not be the kind of love that sparks headlines, but it's the kind that endures where others fade, affection without demand, mutual admiration without expectation, and above all peace. Peace not because everything was perfect, peace because they no longer need it to be. Their journey redefines what post-love can look like, how the people who once challenged and changed us can still coexist in our story, not as regrets, but as reminders of who we became because of them. Benny doesn't wish he could go back. He doesn't dwell on undone chapters. Instead, he chooses to honor the music, the missteps, the magic, and her. Because behind every great song ABBA gave the world, there was a deeper, quieter song playing inside Benny Andersson, a song not written for charts or fans, but for a woman who helped shape everything he later became, not just as a musician, but as a man. There was a time when Benny Andersson believed his music would always be louder than his feelings, that the melodies he sent out into the world might say everything he couldn't. For decades, it worked. He created timeless classics, sold hundreds of millions of records, and became one of the most accomplished songwriters of his generation. And yet at 78, standing on the edge of his life's greatest creations, it's the quiet truths that remain. The truth about her, about Anni-Frid. Not in the way fans speculated, digging through lyrics and releases for breadcrumbs of confession, but in the real unpolished way that only time and courage can finally uncover. Benny never wanted to make Frida the center of a love story the world consumed. Their history wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't even a tragedy. It was something far more complicated, a deep, layered, and ultimately unfinished connection written not just in song but in silence. We didn't really say goodbye, he reflected recently. We just stopped, and the years filled the space where words should have been. Those words would eventually reappear, not in a reunion album or tell-all book, but in actions, in the way they now stand next to each other, in the way their eyes still search one another's for understanding, in the way Benny speaks about her with a softness reserved only for first loves, or final ones. At the Voyage anniversary, someone asked Benny if being back in the spotlight stirred old flames. He smiled politely, shook his head, and said something far more poignant. No bright sparks, just a very gentle light that never went out. That gentle light now illuminates not only their relationship, but the full picture of what ABBA love was and still is. 4 people, 2 couples, woven together by ambition, timing, and fate. Relationships that began in rhythm and often ended out of tune. But more than anything, a reminder that human connection isn't linear. It bends, it breaks, and sometimes it circles back when you least expect it. Today, younger generations discover ABBA without knowing the emotional architecture beneath the music. They hear Super Trooper and feel joy, but maybe not the bitterness in the background. They dance to Gimme, 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 without knowing the longing in the lyrics. That's the power Benny helped create, the ability to hold contradiction in harmony, and perhaps that's the final truth he needed time to understand. That love, loss, success, regret, they were never meant to cancel each other out. They were all part of one song, complicated, yes, beautiful, always. Frida once said, "We sang about emotions we didn't fully understand at the time. Now all 4 members can step back from the walls of fame and see those emotions with clarity." For Benny especially, the truths he couldn't speak in his 30s now arrive naturally in his 70s. Not as revelations, but as reconciliations, and he's not alone in this clarity. In the aftermath of that unexpected public reunion, Frida gave a brief interview of her own. Voice calm, eyes warm, she said, "Sometimes the ending isn't what you think. Sometimes the story just continues differently." When asked what she meant, she just smiled, and perhaps that said everything. Benny and Frida's story, like ABBA's, was never just about music. It was about 2 people who made space for each other in one of the most pressure-filled, emotionally demanding periods in modern music history. They fell in love. They fell apart. They showed up anyway. For years they chose professionalism over vulnerability. But now, age has gifted them something youth couldn't: peace without permission, love without label. So now, at 78, Benny Andersson finally admits what his songs have whispered all along, that there was a woman, an extraordinary woman, who changed him. Not just in his 20s, not just on tour buses, or film sets, or in studios filled with cables and coffee cups, but across decades. She changed the way he understood emotion. She taught him that distance doesn't dissolve meaning, that silence can hold affection, and that failure doesn't end love, it just turns it into something else. He says he doesn't believe in regrets, and maybe that's true, but you can hear something in his voice now, that low reflective tone of someone who has learned the difference between knowing love and understanding it. Years later, long after the moment has passed, perhaps the truth about Frida, the one Benny finally confirms, isn't a shocking reveal. There's no scandal here, only sentiment, only longing, only admiration wrapped in melody, and maybe that in the end is what made their story last longer than ABBA itself. Not perfection, but presence, being there, still caring, still remembering, still watching their younger selves dance on digital stages while their older selves sit, side by side, smiling quietly to each other. No bright sparks, just a very gentle light that never went out.